this just show you very quickly again. Let's start from, okay. Yellow boxes, all yellow boxes are questions. So the yellow boxes, the first one is the Manishtana. Then the answer to that one is we were slaves to our Pharaoh in Egypt. And then we come to the end, to the green boxes are the answers. Red boxes are where we say thank you. So the second set of questions is the 4 sons. And the answer there is about a spiritual redemption. Our forefathers were slaves in Egypt. And then we went down to Egypt, we redeemed, etc. Then we get the thank you at the end is the red box. Third time is what I call the yeshiva version. That's the question is, what did Laban do to us? The answer is this explication of the text, the central text that the rabbis say is the text of the Haggadah, which is my father, an Aramean tried to destroy my father, which comes from the book of Devarim. And then we do the Dayenu as the thank you. That's the red box, sort of column number 3 as you move from right to left. And then the third one is the story told through food. Why this food? Why that food? Why the third food? And then we go, and at the end, we say Hallel, we say thank you at the end of that. Moving from that, I think there's a very important story to be told through food. And here, I think this is something everyone can relate to. And I'm just going to throw it out there for you. Okay? Not a secret that you have to spend a lot of money on wine. Now, where in the Torah does it say you need wine at your Seder? Anyone can unmute and answer if they wish.
Dropping blood.
Yeah, okay, that's a good reference, right? There's the wine looks like the blood, but that's a good interpretation. You have to move your thumb in funny directions as you say such things, right? Nowhere in the Torah does it tell you to drink wine at your Seder. Matzah, I can find. Maror, I can find. Lamb, I can find. I can't find wine. And this is odd because I listed for you here the first 9. I went and did a search. I looked for wine in the Torah. First wine in the Torah, Noach gets drunk and gets compromised. Second time, Lot gets drunk and sleeps with his daughters. Yes, I know, you may have missed that story in the Bible class. The third one is that Jacob gives his father Isaac wine before he steals the blessing, right? The fourth one, there's one in the blessing of Judah. You know, wine becomes a little less pejorative as we move through, right? But the Kohanim are not allowed to use wine during temple service. That's number 6. And the Nazir, this individual who wants to be even more holy, he's prohibited from drinking wine. So why did the rabbis in their infinite wisdom say you can't start your Seder without 4 cups of wine? Okay, so someone give me an answer to this. And this is where you can engage people in your Seder. What does a glass of wine mean with dinner?
Freedom, kingdom.
Right, freedom. I would say luxury, right? You know, there's a reason there's a saying, right? Champagne tastes but a beer budget, right? You know, a bottle of wine in BC, I only buy the kosher varieties, but I'm guessing you can't buy a bottle of wine for under $15 in BC. And if it's a good bottle of wine, you're probably paying $20, $25. I'm just, I know for the kosher ones, that's, where you're ballparking. And, beer is relatively cheaper. And, wine is something to display a sense of luxury. And so the wine is really something special.
Rabbi?
Yes.
So I have a question. In history, what I have read, and please correct me if you believe that I'm incorrect, is that water, especially in the what I'm going to call the old world, was mainly not drinkable. If you go to Europe, it's certainly a case where
I think that's Aaron. I think that's true when you get to Europe, France. But I don't think that was true in the Middle East. Okay. And so I think even when I think what you have to understand and this is maybe I rushed into this point too quickly. The Haggadah it's a layered effect. It's the effect of, this is how different people told this story in different times. And so the reason you have foretellings of the story is because different people felt that a different style of telling the story was going to be better in different eras. And so there was a time when the rabbi said, we need to demonstrate more luxury at our Seder. So we're going to force you to lean, and we're going to tell you to have 4 cups of wine, like the really wealthy Romans did, or the really wealthy Greeks did. And so they wanted you to display your luxury. It wasn't enough to talk about it, right? This had to be a multimedia event. And so the snapshot of the Seder, one snapshot of the Seder, is the fact that it belonged to a moment in history where actually not long before the Jews first have their printed instructions of the Seder. The first printed instructions of the Seder are in the Mishnah, let's say 200 CE. About 300 years before that was the first accusation by a Greek in Alexandria, who said that the Jews there was no exodus from Egypt. They were kicked out because they were lepers. And the rabbis were saying, no. You Jews are not some low-class leprous people that were spit out of Egypt as rejects. You guys are a nation of priests. You need to have self-respect. And so they built into the Seder the story of learning self-respect, which is wine, which is leaning, which is luxury. And so that is part of the Seder story. That food becomes a center part of the Seder story. For those of you who join me every morning, you'll forgive me for going over this, but this is a fascinating thing. We do a pale version of matzah, completely missing a huge dimension of matzah. In the days of the Gaonim, Babylonia, 10th century, and in the days of Rashi and his grandsons, they made the matzah Erev Pesach. The sources talk about the matzah being warm out of the oven. And I'm almost certain the matzahs were soft. And if you have ever gone to one of these Israeli places where they serve a lafa, an eish tanur, right out of the oven, that's what your matzah would have tasted like. You know, it was a quick bread, but it was warm and it was soft out of the oven. Yeah, and first of all, I find it difficult to believe that with all the things to do, they found time to be able to bake matzah right before the Seder. But with the way they talk about this is they make the matzah almost as part of the action of the Seder. It is part of what's happening there. It is part of the act that is being put on, that even though it's happening before the Seder, it's part of the act. And this food, the production of the food, also tells the story. Now, this is, for us, unfortunately, this is a forgotten part. And as an Orthodox rabbi, I cannot officially tell you to make your own matzah. But I will tell you that you can come this Sunday. Rabbi Schachter's doing a matzah baking workshop, and you can come and you can actually bake matzah and see what it's like and learn the rules and then maybe do it. But the idea that you have hot matzahs on your table, I'm telling you, that's a whole other story. It's a whole other level of story. And people will have a whole other dimension of memory of that moment if the matzahs are warm out of the oven, right? As if we just baked them. And there is, I think, there is something to be said by using these food items, asking questions, drawing out people's associations with the food. Remember, Proust writes this whole book, after eating a madeleine, right? Remembrances of things past. There is an enormous connection between food and memory. My wife, the neuropsychologist, tells me that the olfactory center and the memory center and the emotional centers are right next to each other in the brain. So we remember things based on smell. Okay. Actually, I'm going to just go a little bit out of order. I wanted to just point out again this lesson that there are a number of stories being told here. The Haggadah is a layering of a number of different stories. All of the stories, I will say, are authentic stories. This, you know, part of one thing to understand about the Haggadah and the story of telling the Exodus is that, generally speaking, you know, we were all sort of raised with this idea that the winners write history, right? That the winners are the authors of history. Losers don't write history. Well, the Haggadah, in a way, is a debunking of that. Jews have a very special contribution to the world. There's a historian of the Crusades who says that Jews write the epic of defeat. And, you know, usually epics are, you know, Odysseus comes home and he beats up all the people who are abusing his wife, right? And you know, Achilles, rather Odysseus, they win, they conquer Troy, right? So these are those are the epics of history. They're the epics of the victors. But we Jews, we write an epic of defeat, that we can take something that was essentially maybe a narrative of shame, and we turn it into something which is a narrative of salvation. And that is, in the essence here, is the ability to, freedom to a certain extent is the ability to craft your own history, to master your own narrative. And in this, you can read the Passover story authentically in three ways at least, if not more. Now, the first one is the one I think most of us are familiar with. That is sort of the straightforward bread and butter one. Political liberation. We were slaves in Egypt. Now we're free. Thank you, God, for making us free, right? And there are lots of things to point to on that. We speak about the suffering of the slaves. We speak about the work the Egyptians put on us, and we speak about the fact that God redeemed us and He took us out, not with a angel, not with a seraph, but God Himself slew the Egyptians, and we walked through the sea. Right? Fantastic political liberation. Now we're free. Pharaoh is no longer on our back. Certainly one version of the story. There is another version of the story which I will argue is actually more authentic, and that is the one of spiritual epiphany. Spiritual epiphany is the name of the holiday. The holiday of the name of the holiday is Pesach, because Pesach means God skipped over some houses and delivered a death blow to other houses. And this idea that there is a God who takes a nation out of another nation, there's a God who looks after my life, there's a God who is worrying for my protection, that is a spiritual epiphany. That is a recognition that the story, Egyptians are schmiptions. I don't care about the politics. It is the fact that God protected you. Because one day there's not going to be Egyptians. One day there's going to be Ukrainians, and another day there's going to be neo-Nazis. The anti-Semites, the names of the anti-Semites change. You know, it's Haman one year, it's Khmelnytsky the next year. But what is the constant in there? The constant there is God has protected us to this point, and it is the movement from our forefathers who were idol worshipers, who believed in randomness, who believed in gods that had no morality. And the God that I believe in is protecting me and as asking me to be moral. If I give my tzedakah, if I say my prayers, then God will take care of me. The third and last story, which is the one I referenced earlier, that each one of those sections ends with a thank you. This is part of the gratitude narrative. And part of gratitude is the narrative of everyone who's hungry, let them come and eat. when the Haggadah tells its story, it tells a story that ultimately ends with sharing food. That this is an integral part of the story. I don't have time to prove that with you today because I'm trying to cover a little bit of ground. But my point is that there are different stories to tell. In this capacity, there are numerous rabbis from the Abarbanel who wrote his Haggadah in, I think, 1485. He tells the story of his life in Spain and how difficult his life was. And then I think in the final edition of his Haggadah, he talks about how he was kicked out of all these different lands and how difficult his life was, but he felt the hand of God in his life. He tells his own personal story in his Haggadah. They say about the Klosenberger Rebbe, Rabbi Halberstam, that he tells every year during Pesach, he would tell the story of his survival in the labor camps of the Nazis, because that was his story. That's the Vihisha Amda Lavotenu Velanu. God stood us in every generation, and people should tell their individual stories. One of the things which I think is really interesting, do this before the Seder, go take out a map and take everybody at the Seder table and draw where they started from, right? Because there's some people who started in South Africa, ended up here in Canada, where they went Lithuania, South Africa, Canada. Other people, go from, I have friends from Ethiopia who went to Israel and then Vancouver, right? My family was Belarus, Presburg, Hamburg, New York City, Vancouver, right? And now the goal is for everybody to get back to Israel, but to see all the different bullets that you dodged along the way, that's also a story. Your own personal story needs to be part of the Seder. Now, you're going to forgive me for my next one because I'm going to completely nerd out on everyone. We'll get back to the four sons. Now, this is, don't laugh, role-playing is key. Somebody in one of my rabbinic chats sent me the Dungeons and Dragons Haggadah. Now, I'm usually not this kitschy, and I can't imagine anyone in my family actually doing this. But I can imagine that there's certain people who are just nerdy enough to really love doing a Dungeons and Dragons Haggadah. Now, some of you may not know what Dungeons and Dragons is. Dungeons and Dragons is a role-playing game where you roll the dice and the dungeon master walks you through various scenarios, and it takes you through various places, and it asks you to sort of role play and problem solve along the way. Now, this, by the way, is the AI generated version of the four sons as elves. We'll get back to them. I have a little exercise for us on the four sons. But what is happening in this particular version is that this author wrote, unbeknownst, and this is how Dungeons and Dragons works. It works by, there's a prompt, you role play, you roll dice to see how you get out. But here's what's happening. Unbeknownst to the adventurers, one of the halfling servers is a Roman spy. He was sent to infiltrate the Jewish festivities and cause havoc. He surreptitiously coated the wine cups with fine and invisible diuretic. It is no longer on the cup, but it's all over your hands. Your band is in danger of having an unpleasant feast if you don't wash your hands promptly. Those with a weaker constitution are in greater danger. Suggested play, all players roll D20 to check their constitutions. Players should wash their hands from lowest score to highest score. So this is, I'm not expecting anybody here to do this. But what I love about this is somebody went in and said, I'm going to deep dive into role play. I am going to deep dive into telling the Seder in a way where I am fully immersed as a character in the Seder. This is, to me, super interesting because it allows you to get into the headspace of what this experience is all about. Now, of course, I originally talked about the headspace of Rabbi Halberstam and him telling his own personal story. But, I can't do that authentically. I can't tell a story of my survival in the Holocaust. I don't have a single relative who was in Europe. Actually, that's not true. My father's second cousin in France survived, but I can't tell his story. I can tell about him telling his story, but I can't tell his story. But if you want to kind of get into something, some sort of way of bringing out the drama of the Seder, I think is very important. And you may be able to compose, it could ask people to do a charade, give somebody a card and tell them, describe what a day in the life of a slave would be. What was it like working for Pharaoh? I heard one rabbi talk about something very interesting just recently. Rabbi Akiva says, through the merit of righteous women, the Jews were redeemed from Egypt. Now, we say that it's a line. Let's go through this exercise right now. Jewish women as the property of Egyptian taskmasters. What do you imagine the experience was of Jewish women as slaves in Egypt? Anyone? Give me a something.
Very good. The Poa and Shifra were very busy.
Okay, so Tony is giving the for public consumption version that the Jewish women, they had these mirrors. They ultimately went to make the basin, the laver in the holy temple, and they would make themselves beautiful because they had hope that they should have children, that one day be liberated. Fantastic. That's a great midrash, beautiful, love it. It's a very good story, right? But Tony, what else could have happened? I'll give you let me ask you a question. That in the middle of Bamidbar, there's a story about this child who has an Egyptian father and a Jewish mother. How do you think that happened?
Obviously, like women who are downtrodden everywhere in the world at any given time, they were subjected to unwanted or put themselves in a position of being attached to the Egyptians.
Well, I wouldn't even use I think there's a word for it. It's called rape.
That's right.
And it happened. It's generally
there's another side to it. I believe there's another side to it. Nazis
raped Jews in Europe, and plantation owners raped their female slaves. And I'm not an expert in slavery or in this area, but I think the conquerors tend to rape the conquered. I think that's a sort of a constant throughout history. So there is I wouldn't tell this with 5-year-olds at the table, but there is a story to be told there, and that is part of the pain of slavery. So you can, by jumping into these scenarios, you can imagine a little bit more what that is all about. And so I think I wouldn't want to do a Seder without some kind of role-playing imagination. And the truth is, if you don't want to be emotionally risky, and you don't want to put something out there that is very role-playish, the library is filled with books, and the internet is filled with examples of the treatment of modern-day slaves. And there is a constancy to the way slaves are treated. Bring a picture, show something, demonstrate to people what that's about.
Yeah, but that story in the Midbar, that could have been the woman could have been from the Erev Rav that accompanied the Jews when they came out. So it doesn't have to be a story of a rape.
It's true. But you think the Egyptians were that pristine that they didn't abuse any women?
No, we were talking about the Jewish guy marrying the non-Jewish woman.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear. That's a
I mean,
possibility.
I
It is-
mean,
right. So Tony, it's a possibility. You're right. It's a possibility it was consensual. It is also a possibility that she was in a position where she couldn't not consent.
So Rabbi, does that give us a situation then that when we say that only a very small proportion of the actual Jews that were the descendants of the people that
20% left.
went down
20% left.
were
Yes.
actually Jewish? Could that be that those that stayed behind were actually mostly Egyptian?
No, I mean I wouldn't go that far.
We don't know
Now
for
you're
sure.
taking an imagination and building a castle upon it. I think that's hard to say.
Hard to say, but not impossible.
Well, I don't. Yeah, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I wouldn't go there if you ask me. Not where I'm.
So then that leaves us that a significant proportion, if the historical truism continues, that a significant proportion of the people who left Egypt, in fact, were the product of rape, and
No, wait, Aaron.
therefore,
I did not say anything like that.
no, but it's historically more accurate.
Well, I don't know that that's. You don't know that that's true either. I mean, here I'll put it to you in these terms. I mean, I don't know. I haven't studied this, and neither have you. So we're both just sort of pontificating in thin air. But if you did genetic testing of people in 1872, and you asked African, and you did 23andMe in 1872, and you tested most African Americans, how much white blood would they have? European blood would they have in their, or European DNA would they have? That's the question. And I don't know whether you had, enormous amounts. So I can't say. And I don't want to chase this rabbit hole any further. We can perhaps discuss it at a different time. But on that theme, if you do want to talk about that theme, and just so everybody knows, what Aaron is referring to is in Parshat B'Shalach, it says V'chamushim alu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, and it said chamushim, which can mean one of two things. It either means they went out armed, the Jewish people went out armed, or 20% of the Jewish people went out. Now that is something to discuss at your Seder. That 20% of the Jews left because minority cultures are swallowed by majority cultures, even in Egypt. And so that is a question that you can pontificate at your Seder, is are we being swallowed up by the broader Canadian, American, Western culture, right? Now there's a good discussion for your Seder, right? And how is it that we survived? How is it that we survived the Pharaohs and the Nebuchadnezzars and the Khmelnytskys, but we're having trouble surviving the Trudeaus and the Bidens and the Trumps and the Bushes and the et cetera. I don't want to be. It's not about a political party. It's about the comfortable environment that we're in. That is a discussion for your Seder, because the Seder is about the preservation of this Jewish story. Okay.
So if we take 20%, that means there were 3 million Hebrews in Egypt.
No.
At one
3 million went out. 3 million went out. That means there was
600 went out.
600,000 adult males between 20 and 60.
600,000. So 20. If these were 20, then it makes it that the Jews were 300, which means 2.4 Hebrews stayed back in Egypt. Doesn't make sense.
No. Okay. 600,000 is the number of adult males in the census. The rabbis assume once you add the women and the children, you get to 3 million. So that means that they were 20% there were 15 million Jewish slaves in Egypt.
Which means so many of them stayed in Egypt. So the Egyptians are.
Well, look, the tradition is that they died in the plague of darkness. There are different ways where that is counted. Some maybe died in Makat Bechorot, in the slaying of the firstborn, because they didn't do the Karban Pesach. They didn't do the Passover offering. So yeah, those are all. But these are all good things to discuss and contemplate at your Seder, right? Why did people not do this? Why were they not willing to take the risk? Actually, let me go back to my 4 sons. Now, I told you that I wanted to give you strategies for telling the story. So a strategy for telling the story, some people are very visual. And this is a visual story. I've showed you this before, but it's worth showing you again. These are Haggadot spanning roughly 400 years apart, a little more than 400 years apart. So this is a Prague woodcut Haggadah from 1526. So notice that the Rasha, the wicked son, is dressed like a knight. Amsterdam, 1695, the wicked son, has a sword and a shield. USA, 1920, the wicked son has, he's the boxer. Somehow or other, the wicked son is always represented with the instruments of violence, whatever the instruments of violence are in that particular day. I think that's an interesting concept, an interesting visual history. And you can use your own interpretations of these. One that I just find the most interesting, and I'll just let me just do a little drawing here for you, is this is the wicked son in the Zionist Haggadah of Tzvi Livni of 1955. This is the wicked son. Now notice that he's the Israeli with the tie on, right? And the idea is he's abandoning these very Zionist things, the watchtower, the shovel, the agriculture. So he's a city slicker, right? And the Zionist ideal was, get your hands dirty, right? So he's not really participating in the great activity that gets people together. And I love I don't know when Israelis started wearing ties. I don't know if there was a tie to be found in Israel in 1955. But anyway, that's how they represented him. He was the city slicker, which I just find rather rich. Now there are collections of these. I think there's the Hartman Haggadah has a whole collection of the representation of the 4 sons over history, and it's a great way to get people involved, right? Because the talking about, well, how do we tell this story to different people? How is the story told in different generations? And that is I think another central piece of the Haggadah. Okay, moving. Oh, sorry. Okay. Oh, in this, by the way, I was curious. This is a complete side point. I was interested in what would happen if we asked artificial intelligence to draw the 4 sons for us today. The reason I was interested in this is because artificial intelligence really is this aggregate of human intelligence. So I was wondering, what would happen if you asked it to draw the 4 sons? Actually, I asked somebody who's involved in AI to try and produce something for me, and it produced some things which are really weird, which points out a couple of things. Number one is the question you ask will determine the answer you get, which is a very fascinating, very Seder-like point. And this idea of where we outsource our intelligence is a very Haggadah question, because don't forget that the Jewish liberation ceremony, I think I heard this from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. It could be either Rabbi Jonathan Sachs or it could be Rabbi Avram Torsky, or it could be both of them. But this is a very important point. In the United States, we shoot off cannons and we light fireworks and we wave flags. In North Korea, they have parades with guns. What do Jews do for their liberation ceremony? They have an educational event. That is our liberation moment. And so the question of what is the dominant intellectual force that is coming to our shores is very relevant to the Seder. So I was interested in how would the Seder produce this. One thing I did find is there is an AI-produced Haggadah, dangerous concept, that we're outsourcing the telling of the story to a computer. This is their page of the 4 sons. which probably means they asked AI to generate for them a picture of 4 children. And these are the 4 children that it generated. Not, it wasn't a picture of, a wise, wicked, or simple son or daughter, as the case may be. But anyway, I thought that was just an interesting thing to bring up at your Seder. Okay, last but not least, I want to help us dig down into this story of the Seder. And actually, I'm going to go back to this slide. So this middle section right here, the section of my forefathers were a wandering Aramean, that whole bit, right? So this is what I said this is the sort of the yeshiva telling of the section. And based on what the yeshivas would have been studying in let's say the 4th century. And so this is how they would go about interpreting the Bible. And they were masters at interpreting the Bible because they knew every sentence of the Bible. And so they would take a word and they wouldn't say, well, where does this word appear elsewhere? So one of the words that they're looking at is that what were we made to in Egypt? We were made into a great nation. And so they expound on this word, made into a great nation, which takes us to this slide. And by the way, I apologize for my clumsy handling of the slides. It seems like that I got an update on my slideshow program, which now has me navigating differently. So I'm going to have to relearn it. But for the moment, you'll forgive me. This is the section where the rabbis learn the word Rav, great. And they learn it from this word, Rivava. I cause you to increase even as the growth of the field. And you did increase and grow up, and you came to excellence and beauty. Thy breasts were fashioned, and thy hair was grown, and you were naked and bare. So those of you who join me on my regular Monday night class, we did this as part of the 16th chapter of Yechezkel. And when I was a kid, this was the thing that made me chuckle, right? Why are we talking about breasts in the middle of the Seder? Well, the rabbis were actually such clever readers that they understood that this chapter was the right chapter, because this chapter has something in it that I've never seen in any other chapter of the Bible. This is the chapter of the Bible where God accuses the Jewish people of belonging to a different nation. Here's the English. The Amorite was your father, and your mother was the Hittite. And the commentary said, what, are you insulting Abraham and Sarah? Right? Abraham and Sarah are our parents. Why are you calling us the Amorite and the Hittite? And the insult here is, you Jewish people are undoing your nationality. There is a point at which you Jewish people upend your own ability to identify as Jews. In the particular context here, the historical context, Jews were chasing after every Canaanite religion. They were giving their children over to the fire god Molech, and they were worshiping Baal Peor, and they were worshiping the fertility goddess Ashtarte, and they were doing all sorts of things with the Assyrian gods and the Babylonian gods and the Canaanite gods. And they had basically abandoned their entire Jewish roots, which included, by the way, abandoning the prohibition against enslaving their fellow Jews. They had un-Jewished everything, right? And so, you can sort of ask yourself, what is it that would make someone no longer Jewish? You want a good question to pop at your Seder. When you see that sentence about naked and bare, you pull this out. This is the 16th chapter of the book of Ezekiel. Chapter 16, verses 3 through 7. That's all you need to know. And you say, this is when the Jewish people are accused of losing their Judaism. So you ask yourself, how far would a person need to go? What would push a person so far out that they would be non-Jewish? Is it tattoos? Is it that they would have a wake at their funerals? Is it that they, I don't know what the non-Jewishest thing. I live a little too insulated in the Jewish world, right? But that question is an important question, because what this particular section is saying is God took care of you. He shepherded you. Now here it's talking about Egypt and the whole experience of going through Egypt and Jerusalem and all that. But for us, our story is an interesting one. It's much deeper than that. God took us out of Egypt, and then he brought us back out of Babylon. And then we survived the Romans and the Fatimids and the Abbasids and the Umayyads and the Byzantines and the Persians and the Slavs and the Russians and the Hungarians and the English and the French and the Ferdinand and Isabella and the Almohades. I mean, you could go on and on and on and on forever, all the things that we've survived. For 4,000 years we've survived, right? At what point are you going to turn your back on that identity, on that miracle? So again, if you want to find this particular section comes after the statement, my father was an Aramean tried to destroy my father. And there's a whole interpretation of these verses from the book of Devarim. And in the middle of that, when they say a great nation, so they're going to quote this great nation like what? Like Rivava, like great. And here, this is talking about the foundling child as the foundling becomes mature and beautiful. And this is the verses that Yechezkel uses, the whole breasts naked and bare. That's just a way of saying the Jewish people became mature, attractive, beautiful. And you guys seem to have forgotten that God raised you up to be the mature, attractive, beautiful nation that you are. And so that's a question, I think, that's sort of hangs in the air for us. We Jewish people. There's a lot of questions swirling about Jewish identity now. So, okay. So, I believe this is my last slide. So, I'm going to, if people want, and I'm aware that sometimes these things can oversaturate. So if people want, I have one last thing that I want to show you about the choice of the narrative at that stage of that story of an Aramean tried to destroy my father. But I want people to tell me. I want people to tell me that they're not saturated and they want to hear this one last tidbit.
Go ahead.
Okay, here we go. We're
Yes,
sharing the next piece. Okay. I have to get to the right chapter. Sorry. Select chapter 26. Okay. Here we go. Devarim 26. Now, where are we in Devarim 26? First of all, if you thought the Torah should really be choosing something from the book of Exodus, like, isn't that where the story is told? Well, it turns out that the story is told in lots of places, but they oddly choose a section in the book of Devarim, and they start with this scenario where the Jewish farmer has his first fruits and brings them up to the Kohen, brings him up to the priests in the temple, and he's presenting his first fruits. And it says, and you shall speak and say before Hashem your God, a wandering Aramean was my father. Now this is an interesting piece, because Arami Oved Avi, my father was a wandering Aramean, or alternatively translated as an Aramean tried to destroy my father. And it's so interesting that it could refer to Abraham or it could refer to Jacob. It's not clear, and I think it's deliberately ambiguous. It's brilliant as both, because it's a story about how we were unlanded, and so therefore we were vulnerable, and we were also homeless. Those two things walk together. But the story here is really the story of how these first fruits got here, which is before I could bring these fruits, we were wanderers. And then we went down to Egypt. I'm going to do it in English. And he went down to Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and he became a great nation, mighty and populous. By the way, this is where that word varav comes in, right? And right with the section in Yechezkel comes right here when they interpret this word varav and populous. And then it says the Egyptian dealt ill with us and afflicted us and laid us in hard bondage. This should ring a bell in your Haggadah. And we cried out to the Lord our God, the God of our fathers. The Lord heard our voice, saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. And the Lord brought us forth out of Egypt with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, with great terribleness, and with wonders. And when we get to wonders, wonders! Let me tell you how many wonders there were. And then that's when we go into Dayenu. Right? It's so really, what do we say we're talking about? It's sentence 5, 6, 7, 8. That's what what I call the yeshiva telling of the Haggadah is.
Right.
Right? So that's now, but the Mishnah says something very interesting. The Mishnah says you start from these words, Arami Oved Avi, right here. Actually, let me do it in annotation form. The Mishnah says you start from there until you finish the parsha. Now, there's really only one meaning to finish the parsha. That's here. This little samach means that when you write the Torah, that's the end of the section. So you're supposed to interpret until the end of the section.
No,
we end here. Sentences 9, 10, and 11 don't get interpreted. They're not in your Haggadah.
Not a problem.
Isn't that interesting?
You want another $1,000. So if you're bloody smart, why aren't you rich?
So the
I think you better.
So
Sorry, can you repeat? There was a noise.
I just did it. Okay, so can I repeat? In blue, I'm gonna show you where we are in the Hag. Let me clear the drawings, and I'm gonna show you again. Okay. The Mishnah says you start here, and it tells you to end at the end of the parsha. So the red brackets are what the Mishnah seems to say. In your Haggadah, though, I'm going to circle in blue what you do. You start here, you go down here, and you end at wonders. Right? So the blue is what's in your Haggadah. What's not in your Haggadah? We'll make that green. This section right here. This section here is Vivienu ala makom hazeh. You brought us to this place, meaning Israel, and you gave us this land flowing with milk and honey, and now behold, the first fruit of the land that God has given me, and you shall set it down before the Lord your God, and worship before your God, and you shall rejoice in all the good that the God gave you unto thee, and to the house, and to the Levite and the stranger that is in your midst. Right? So there are really two themes here. One is the land of Israel, and the other one is rejoicing with the Levite and the Kohen and the stranger. That's what's missing from your Haggadah. So one theory of the case is, all right, so when was Haggadah written? So the Haggadah is written, the Mishnah gets written down 150 years after the destruction of the temple. At that point, the Romans don't let the Jews into Jerusalem, right? And then for the next 2,000 years, Jews are living in the context where they can't say they're going to go back to the land of Israel. And so you don't have this idea, which I think is central to the real Haggadah. The real story is that we went to the land of Israel. This is why I think Dayenu is subversive, because when we get to this word over here, wonders, we say this poem, we say the song that says, if you took us out of Egypt and didn't take us into the land of Israel, that would be enough. But everybody knows that it really wouldn't be enough. But we can't deal with the whole thing. We can't deal with the real Zionism. So I think one simple understanding is that this section of the Haggadah, this was meant to be there. Originally, when they said you should do this, these last 3 sentences are meant to be there. There should be a section about that. And there are rabbis in Israel who today read these sections, and they do a 5th cup of wine to say that the 5th language of redemption, veheveti, that God will bring us the land of Israel, that's also been fulfilled, right? That there is this Zionist element that has to be part of the Haggadah. But your Haggadah cuts it off early. Your Haggadah just truncates it, because we're not ready to deal with the Zionism except to say next year in Jerusalem. But that itself is a fascinating story. One of my teachers, Rabbi Menachem Liebtag, has a very interesting interpretation of the reason the end of the parsha, and he said it's about this part. And this is where I say it's about the gratitude, because he says you have to finish the parsha. Why? Because you have to speak about the gratitude. You have to be thankful, and you have to be sharing your food. That's the reason we start with saying anybody who's hungry, let them come and eat. But part of your Seder has to be about bringing yourself to a sense of gratitude and to a sense of sharing, because that's really the end of the parsha that is read. So, anyhow, that is our I guess the encore of this whole discussion.